I'm Ryan North, writer of The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's July 16th, 2021. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Ryan North about The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher, a Johnny Constantine graphic novel. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Ryan is a New York Times best-selling and Eisner-winning writer whose recent work includes the nonfiction How to Invent Everything, a survival guide for the stranded time traveler, the Eisner-nominated semi-fictional graphic novel adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, and the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl series for Marvel. He's also twice collaborated with William Shakespeare on choose-your-own-path versions of his plays. He lives in Toronto, where he writes for video games, television, and his long-running webcomic, Dinosaur Comics. Ryan's current project is The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher, a Johnny Constantine graphic novel, which introduces readers to an underage Constantine as a magic-wielding mischief maker comes to the United States to go to boarding school. There he'll find himself completely out of his depths when he finds himself going head-to-head against a teacher who may be a witch. Getting to the bottom of this magical mystery will take befriending a fellow young magician and obtaining help from a familiar rhyming demon. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Ryan North about The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher, a Johnny Constantine graphic novel. So, Ryan North, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time. What I normally do to start off the interview is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
I actually do, because I lived in a rural area with no comic book stores. And so the very first comic I ever read, I got it in my stocking at Christmas from Santa. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And it was a Wonder Woman comic. And it was part, 4 of 7 of an arc. And they didn't do recaps in those days. And I was completely lost. I knew nothing what was happening. But I liked it. I had this sort of idea that I liked this medium of comics. So I thought comics were cool, like most kids do, but hopefully like most adults do too. And so I grew up and I got a job and I got a car. And with my first paycheck, I used my parents' car to go to a comic book store in Ottawa, big city. And I picked up 3 comics. One was Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller. One was Superman Peace on Earth, which was Paul Dini and Alex Ross, kind of a picture book Superman story, also great. And the third one was no good, and I've completely forgotten it. But 2 out of 3 for picking books at random in a store is pretty good.
Did you ever pick up on that Wonder Woman series you got in your stocking?
No, I no longer had the comics, so I don't know what it was. Although you're right, I could, go back and see what books were out in Christmas, like 1987, and probably complete the arc and find out what was going on. I should do that. That's a great idea. I will do that.
I wonder if it was George Perez doing the art on that. I forget right now when he was doing it, but it's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Lots of good comics there. I'm wondering who or what inspires you to create today?
I can tell you there is an artist I really admire because of how he's always pushing the medium forward. Every time I read one of his books, I see something done in comics that I haven't seen done before. And that's wild, right? Like when you go to read a novel, you're not expecting to see something done fresh and new with the written word that's unprecedented, but you can still see that in comics, such a young medium. And the artist is Jason Shiga. If you look up his books, every one of them, to my mind, is an instant classic. And the bar he sets of let's do something new and exciting every single time we do a book. I don't meet that bar, but it inspires me to try to meet it every time. He's great.
Cool. So we're here talking about your latest work, The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher. And I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about it and maybe what inspired you to create this story.
Sure. So The Mystery of the Meanest Teacher is a Johnny Constantine graphic novel. So it's taking the character of John Constantine, who is, I would say, famously one of DC's most adult characters, and putting him into this middle grade space, which sounds like a wild idea and is a wild idea. And it probably shouldn't work at all. But that was part of the fun of it, was seeing how we could get this to work. And it actually wasn't that much of a walk as it might sound like, because in the book, Kid Constantine, who likes to be called Kid, is sent to Massachusetts from England, and his magic doesn't work there. And so he's sort of scrambling to keep up and covering and kind of bluffing his way through situations where he doesn't have as much control as he thinks he does. And that's not too far from what the adult Constantine is doing all the time. And it's also not that far from, the experience of being that age and not understanding what's going on, but wanting to look cool, wanting to seem cool, wanting to look like you know what the world's all about. So it was actually very, very smooth to fit this famously adult character into this middle grade space and not lose who he is. Like, getting to keep that same Constantine charm in the book was something that I was really pleased to see that we could pull off.
Great. No, that's good stuff. I wonder, how was it working again with Derek Charm after your successful run on Squirrel Girl? Did you have like a short form for your creation process?
Yeah, it was great. I was chatting with Derek the other day, and he reminded me that the way he came on board was I simply texted him and said, "Do you want to do Kid Constantine?" And he wrote back and said yes, with no other context. Yeah, let's do it. And it's always great when you're working with an artist you've worked with before, because you already had the rapport, and I don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing and insulting, because we already know and like each other. And so the scripts could be a little more informal, but I mean, it's a hard brief for him, because as much as I'm writing this middle grade version of Constantine, he's got to draw it and come up with designs for these characters that, not only look like Constantine as a 13-year-old, but also look like credible clothes that a 13-year-old might wear. And solutions were great. There's a scene where instead of the constant cigarette that Constantine usually has, he has a lollipop stick sticking out of his mouth. He's got a heck razor shirt on at one point. Usually he wears one of those gag shirts that have a suit printed on them, which is so great. I thought that was the coolest stuff when I was a kid. And I'm so jealous that Constantine gets to wear one. So it was very easy to sort of slide back into that mode. Everything clicked very nicely.
Great. That's good. I was curious to know what sort of research you did for this particular character. Did you go all the way back to his incarnation by Alan Moore, or did you start with the New 52?
Oh, I went back to the beginning. I always try to, when working with a character, to read all of it. And that's a hard thing to do. With Squirrel Girl, it was easy because there were like 12 appearances. I could read them all in a weekend. It was great. With Constantine, there was no way I could read all of them. And so I was already familiar with the character initially, actually, through the Justice League cartoons, which was my exposure to a lot of stuff. And then I went back and read some of the earliest ones, skipped ahead a few years, picked up a few trades from that era. It was funny. If you read the Constantine Wikipedia page, have you read it? The John Constantine Wikipedia.
Through it, yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a section labeled "In Real Life," where all these authors who have written Constantine claim to have met him. It began with Alan Moore and goes from there, where they see him at a party or they see him at a pub, and they all kind of try to avoid him because Constantine's not the kind of person you want to know. And I've kept an eye out for like sullen-looking 13-year-olds in trench coats. I haven't spotted one yet, but I was aware that this is something I might be getting myself into by writing the character.
Yeah, that trend could continue. You got to be careful. I want to congratulate you on the Eisner nomination for Slaughterhouse 5. That's fantastic. Fantastic work there. So I'm wondering, what was it like to work on that project, and maybe did you have any trepidation tackling a classic piece of literature?
Oh, the ultimate trepidation, terrifying, 100%. You do not want to be the person who screws up Vonnegut, and I was a huge Vonnegut fan since I first read him in high school. And when I was talking with my editor there at Archaea for this project, I had kind of hoped we could maybe do a lesser vonnegut where the stakes would be lower. And they're like, we really want to do Slaughterhouse 5. So I was terrified. And part of the conception of the project was, let's imagine that Slaughterhouse 5 was always intended to be a comic. So I was no longer the writer, I was the editor. Vonnegut had been commissioned to write this comic book, and he turned in this novel. So I was like, Kurt, there's a lot of great stuff here, but you got the wrong format. So my job was to translate it into that format. Less adaptation and more translation, and try to make it feel like somehow never heard of Slaughterhouse 5 and never heard of Kurt Vonnegut. You wouldn't read this comic and say, oh, what a great adaptation of a prose novel. You'd read it and say, what a great comic, what a great graphic novel. So I wanted to feel like it had been born in the medium and did everything that it could to exploit that medium to its full potential. So it's a very, to my mind, a very sort of comics forward comic. It does all the things that I'd love to see comics doing. It's kind of formalist, it's kind of experimental, but that also ties in nicely with what Vonnegut did with the prose novel. So it felt like they were almost two sides of the same coin, which made it feel like a natural target for adaptation in the first place, in retrospect.
Do you think this success that you've had with this book might encourage you to do another literary adaptation?
Oh, gosh. I know that me and Albert Montes would love to do, he's the artisan book, I should say, would love to do another Vonnegut story, just because we had such a good experience doing the book together. And I feel like in the industry of comics, when you have a good experience, when you find a creative team that clicks, you're like, yeah, let's do that again. Like, why wouldn't we want to do that again? This is great. Which is, why me and Derek did Kid Constantine together, because we really enjoyed the process of making Squirrel Girl. So, I mean, absolutely, I would love to, but it's always a scary thing, because if you mess up a comic you're making yourself, you're only embarrassing yourself, and you're not going to ruin a prose book for somebody else. But if you mess up an adaptation, there's a real risk that you can damage the book for other people. And I say this like I'm already the guy who turned, Romeo and Juliet into a choose your own path interactive book. So clearly I'm fine with making some creative choices. But I feel like, I guess I can say I respect Vonnegut more than Shakespeare. Is that a horrible thing to say?
No, he's more modern. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I mean, they're both great, but I feel like Shakespeare can be taken down a few pegs. I guess when you're as canonized as Shakespeare, where you're treated as like not only a great author, but the best possible author in the entire language, that leaves you a little bit more room for wiggling around and having fun with it than with Vonnegut, where I feel like, not that I know him because I never met the man, but I feel closer to him as a person, I guess. I never discussed it with him before. I'm realizing this as I'm saying it.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense for sure. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, I mean, typically when you go to conventions and festivals, you're probably approached by a variety of people who come up and ask for advice. So I'm wondering, do you have one piece of advice for someone who would want to make their own comic book?
I do. And this is the same if they're an artist and a writer, or just a writer, just an artist. And my advice is to not wait for permission to start doing it. But the core of that is to put it online where people can see. And there's several advantages to doing that. The first is, once you put it online, you have the chance to attract an audience. You might start getting readers or fans, and that's always great. But the second is it's accountability. Like if you're saying, I'm going to do a web comic and I'm going to post once a week, you've now got to meet that deadline. And it's a self-imposed deadline, which are the hardest ones to meet. And I was doing this, like that's how I got my start, doing my webcomic Dinosaur Comics, and I still do it today, and I really enjoy it. I didn't realize until I started getting offers to write, would you please write this comic for me, that a webcomic is not only, like I thought I was doing my fun talking dinosaur comic, but I was also showing this is a guy who can meet a deadline. This is the kind of humor he has. This is the kind of stories he likes to talk about. Like it almost acts as a really long form, visual, hopefully entertaining resume for what you can do. And all that stuff just comes from not only doing the work, but putting it online where people can see it. So my major advice is to share it. And yes, like you will be eventually embarrassed by your early work, but that's great because that just means you become a better artist. So don't worry about one day being like, oh, I'm so embarrassed by this work I put online when I was just starting out, because everyone is. And like you absolutely get better. There's no way you can work at making a comic or writing a comic or drawing a comic for a couple of years and not get better despite yourself. It's just it's the reason it's called a practice. Is the more you do, the better you get at it. So that's what I recommend, is putting stuff online.
Good advice, for sure. Now, we've talked about a variety of different projects that you've completed, but I'm wondering if you can talk about what's next for you. Is there something coming down the road that you're allowed to talk about?
Almost. I wrote a nonfiction book a couple years back called How to Invent Everything, which is a survival guide for stranded time travelers. So if you go back in time and your time machine breaks down, it has everything you need to rebuild civilization from scratch. And that was a really fun project because it's got this fictional wrapper around this nonfiction core that's really a history and an explanation of modern technology that we take for granted and don't really understand. But it was really fun to sort of play with that fictional conceit. And I've been working on kind of a spiritual successor to it that hopefully will be announced soon and should be available in March of next year. But it's not announced yet, so I can't say anything beyond It's really cool and keep your eyes peeled.
Sounds good. Well, Ryan, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
Oh, gosh. I guess what I would say, because when the Kid Constantine book was announced, it felt like there was almost an even split between people who thought, oh, cool, this is exciting. People saying, this is the worst thing that could ever happen to John Constantine. How dare you make a middle grade version of him? And since the book has been out, of those who have read it, it's been universally like, oh, this is, I was skeptical. I didn't think you could capture Constantine in this age group, but you did a good job. And so I don't say this to toot my own horn, but to say, like, give it a chance. If you think maybe this is not for you, it might be for you. It might be perfect for a little heck raiser in your life, a niece or a nephew in that stage.
Thanks to Ryan for the chat. You can discover more about Ryan on Twitter at RyanQNorth and online at ryannorth.ca. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please leave a good rating. Also, check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2021.